Torstein spent his first 5 years in exile, learning skills that most people never imagined existed. He mastered the arts of disguise, infiltration, and information gathering that allowed him to track people across vast distances without them knowing they were being hunted. His network of contacts grew to include merchants, sellswords, tavern keepers, and dock workers across 3 continents. Anyone who might hear useful information about 7 specific men received Torstein's generous payments for keeping their ears open. By his 18th birthday, he possessed complete dossiers on all 7 targets. He knew their current locations, their daily routines, their family connections, their fears, and most importantly, their weaknesses. Eric the Axe had developed a drinking problem. Olaf Halfbeard suffered from recurring fevers. Magnus Stonethrower had become obsessed with proving his strength through dangerous contests. Each man's downfall would be tailored to his specific vulnerabilities, designed to appear natural while delivering justice that fit the crime. Torstein had learned that the most satisfying revenge wasn't hot violence, but cold irony. Eric the Axe was the first to die, which surprised no one who knew about his drinking habits. He was found at the bottom of his own well during winter, apparently having fallen through ice that should have supported a man his size. What the investigation didn't discover was that Torstein had spent weeks weakening that ice with carefully applied heat, creating structural flaws that would collapse under Eric's weight at precisely the right moment. The death appeared accidental to everyone except Eric, who had just enough time to recognize the face of the boy he'd thought was irrelevant 20 years earlier. "Remember me?" Torstein had asked as Eric realized he was falling into freezing water he'd never escape. "I remember you." The second death came 6 months later. Olaf Halfbeard choked on his favorite meal, roasted pork seasoned with herbs that had been carefully contaminated with compounds that would cause his throat to swell shut. Again, the death seemed natural to investigators, but Olaf's final moments were spent staring into the eyes of a man he'd last seen as a terrified child. Magnus Stonethrower died when rocks that had stood for centuries suddenly shifted and crushed him during a demonstration of his legendary strength. Gunnar Ironskull was trampled by his own horse after something spooked the animal during what should have been a routine ride. Sven Bloodeagle succumbed to a fever that resisted every treatment, burning from within until his strength failed completely. Each death followed the same pattern, apparently natural causes, perfectly timed coincidences, and a mysterious witness who appeared just long enough for the victim to understand exactly why he was dying. The surviving members of the Iron Brotherhood began to suspect they were being hunted, but they had no proof and no idea how to defend against an enemy who struck through circumstances rather than direct violence. Fear spread among them as they realized that someone was systematically eliminating their group with methods that couldn't be predicted or prevented. Ragnar the Bold was the 6th to die, succumbing to poison that had been slowly administered over months until his body could no longer function. His death was attributed to natural illness brought on by age and hard living, but his final words suggested he knew better. "The boy," he gasped to his wife as consciousness faded. "The merchant's boy." He kept his promise. This left only one name on Torstein's list: Håkon the Clever, the man who had planned the original murder and distributed the stolen wealth among his companions. Håkon had always been the most paranoid of the Brotherhood, and his suspicions had grown stronger with each death. When a mysterious message arrived bearing a list of 6 names with lines drawn through them, Håkon understood that his 20 years of looking over his shoulder were about to end. His name was at the bottom, unmarked but clearly next. Torstein was only 12 when he watched 7 men murder his father for a handful of silver coins. They thought a child's witness meant nothing, so they let him live. 20 years later, 6 of those men had died in ways that seemed like accidents or bad luck. The seventh man was about to learn that some debts compound with interest, and some children grow up to become very patient collectors. Bjorn, the fair dealer, was the most honest merchant in 3 kingdoms, which made him both wealthy and dangerous to men who preferred dishonest profits. His trade routes connected settlements across the northern territories. His warehouses held goods from distant lands, and his reputation for fair dealing made him trusted by everyone from jarls to thralls. His son Torstein grew up learning the family business, understanding that true wealth came from building relationships rather than exploiting weaknesses. At 12, he could calculate complex trade ratios, speak 4 languages, and navigate by stars his father had taught him to read. But honesty attracted predators. Bjorn's success had caught the attention of 7 men who believed they deserved a share of profits they hadn't earned. They called themselves the Iron Brotherhood, raiders who had grown tired of seasonal pillaging and wanted steady income from established merchants. The plan was simple. Kill Bjorn during what appeared to be a robbery, divide his accumulated wealth, and take over his trade routes. What they hadn't planned for was the merchant's son hiding in the grain cellar, watching through wooden slats as they murdered his father with methodical brutality. The attack came during harvest celebration when most of the settlement was drinking in the great hall. Bjorn was alone in his warehouse, checking inventory and preparing for winter trading expeditions that would never happen. Torstein had returned early from the feast to help his father with calculations, entering through the back door just as 7 armed men confronted Bjorn in the main storage area. Something about their positioning told the boy this wasn't a random robbery. They moved too efficiently, knew exactly where the valuable goods were stored. Bjorn the fair dealer, said their leader, a massive warrior called Eric the Axe. Your success ends tonight. Nothing personal, just business. Take what you want, Bjorn replied calmly, understanding immediately that negotiation was pointless, but harm no one else. My death should satisfy whatever debt you think I owe. Your death satisfies our need for your trade routes, corrected Olaf Halfbeard, drawing his blade. Your goods satisfy our need for coin. Simple mathematics. From his hiding place, Torstein watched his father face death with dignity while 7 men took turns stabbing him, ensuring that responsibility was shared equally among the Brotherhood. They wanted to be certain that none could betray the others without implicating themselves. As his father's blood soaked into the warehouse floor, Torstein memorized every face, every voice, every detail that would help him track these men across the years he knew it would take to bring them justice. After the murderers departed with their stolen wealth, Torstein emerged from hiding to find his father dead but not yet cold. Kneeling beside the corpse, he made promises that would define the next 20 years of his life. I will remember every face, he whispered. I will learn every name. I will track down every man who did this, and I will make sure you all pay exactly what you owe. Survival came first. Torstein used his father's hidden emergency funds to purchase passage on a merchant vessel, telling the captain that his family had died in a plague and he needed to reach distant relatives. The lie was close enough to truth that it carried conviction. But instead of seeking new family, Torstein sought education that would transform him from helpless child into patient hunter. He traveled to Constantinople, where Byzantine spy masters taught him surveillance techniques. He studied in Cordoba, where Arab assassins showed him 17 different ways to kill someone while making it appear accidental. Most importantly, he learned patience from a Chinese merchant who had spent 30 years tracking down the men who destroyed his village. Revenge served cold is revenge served completely, the old man explained. Hot anger burns out quickly. Cold calculation burns forever. Hakon's response was to gather his remaining loyal men and fortify his holdings, believing that superior numbers and defensive preparations could protect him from whatever force had eliminated his brothers. But Torstein had learned that the strongest fortresses had weaknesses that most defenders never considered. The attack came not from outside, but from within. Torstein had spent months infiltrating Hakon's household, disguised as a traveling merchant offering rare goods that appealed to his target's greed. By the time Hakon realized his guest was actually the child whose father he'd murdered, it was far too late for defensive measures. "You should have killed me that night," Torstein said calmly, as Hakon's guards fell to poison that had been administered through their evening meal. "Children remember everything, and some of us grow up to collect debts that others thought were forgotten." Hakon's death was neither quick nor merciful. Torstein had learned techniques during his years of study that could extend dying for hours while maintaining perfect consciousness. The man who had planned his father's murder experienced every sensation his victim had felt, multiplied by the systematic expertise of someone who had devoted his life to understanding pain. As Hakon breathed his last, Torstein produced a leather-bound ledger that he had carried for 20 years. Inside were detailed records of every injustice, every death, and every act of repayment that had followed. "Bjorn the fair dealer," he read aloud, "murdered for 37 silver pieces and trod routes valued at approximately 400 marks. Interest compounded over 20 years at blood rates. Payment collected in full from 7 debtors through systematic application of ironic justice." The final entry was made with steady hands. "Account settled. All debts paid. Justice served cold, as promised." Standing in the fortress that had failed to protect its owner, surrounded by the corpses of men who had thought themselves safe from consequences, Torstein understood that his transformation was complete. The terrified child who had hidden in a grain cellar was gone forever, replaced by something that dispensed perfect justice to those who believed they were beyond accountability. Torstein's reputation spread throughout the Northern Territories as stories of the Iron Brotherhood's systematic destruction became legend. The message was clear. Murder might seem profitable in the short term, but some debts carried interest rates that compounded beyond what anyone could afford to pay. Other merchants found that their trade routes became safer, their warehouses more secure, their negotiations more respectful. Word had spread that somewhere in the world was a man who specialized in collecting blood debts, and his patience was matched only by his precision. But Torstein never again worked as a simple merchant. His father's death had taught him that honesty alone wasn't sufficient protection in a violent world. Sometimes justice required active enforcement by those willing to wait as long as necessary for the right moment to collect what was owed. The boy who had promised to remember every face had kept his word completely. Some promises are too important to break, and some debts are too significant to forgive. 20 years was a long time to wait for justice, but for those who understood the true value of patience, it was exactly the right amount of time for interest to compound into something that could never be repaid in anything but blood. If this tale of ultimate payback moved you, hit that like button and let us know in the comments which part shocked you the most. Subscribe to Time for Payback for more legendary stories where betrayal meets justice, and don't forget to ring that notification bell, because every betrayal has its reckoning, and every story holds the power to change everything. What revenge story should we tell next? Drop your suggestions below. Until next time, remember, karma never forgets.